Hello and welcome to the Strange Tales podcast presented by me, your host Winston R. Douglas. We are a podcast that looks at weird and wonderful tales from history, true crime, conspiracies and much more. I will try to cover various topics from different eras. Hopefully we can take a journey through history together. If you are a first-time listener, please look back on our previous episodes. If you are a returning listener, thank you for your continual support. If you enjoy the podcast, please smash that gorgeous like button, and subscribe so that you will be notified to future shows. Also, if you could write a 5-star review, that would really help us get the word out, so other people can enjoy the podcast as well. You can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube at Strange Tales Pod. Or you can message me at strangetalespod@gmail.com. with feedback or ideas on future shows. If you would like to support the podcast, you can do so through Patreon. Go to patreon.com/strangetalespod, where we have plans from as little as $3 a month, and you can opt out anytime. Any help is much appreciated. This week we take a look at a hijacking of a Boeing 727 aircraft in United States airspace between Portland and Seattle on the afternoon of November 24, 1971. After a stop at Seattle-Tacoma Airport to collect $200,000 in ransom, equivalent to $1.28 million today, and 4 parachutes, he leapt to an uncertain fate over southwestern Washington. Despite an extensive manhunt and a 45-year-long FBI investigation, the perpetrator's identity and fate remain unknown. The crime remains the only unsolved air piracy in commercial aviation history. Available evidence and a preponderance of expert opinion suggested that Cooper probably did not survive his high-risk jump, but the FBI nevertheless maintained an active investigation for 45 years after the hijacking. Despite a case file that grew to over 60 volumes over that period, no definitive conclusions were reached regarding Cooper's true identity or fate. A young boy discovered a small cache of banknotes from the ransom along the banks of the Columbia River in 1980, which triggered renewed interest but ultimately only deepened the mystery. The great majority of the ransom remains unrecovered. Okay, let's get into today's strange tale. The official physical description of Cooper has remained unchanged and is considered reliable. Flight attendants Schaffner and Mucklow, who spent the most time with Cooper, were interviewed on the same night in separate cities, and gave nearly identical descriptions. Around 5 feet 10 inches, 1.78 meters, tall, 180 pounds, 82 kilograms, mid-40s, with close-set piercing brown eyes and swarthy skin. Cooper appeared to be familiar with the Seattle area and may have been an Air Force veteran, based on testimony that he recognized the city of Tacoma from the air as the jet circled Puget Sound, and his accurate comment to Mucklow that McCord AFB was approximately 20 minutes driving time from the Seattle-Tacoma airport, a detail most civilians would not know, or comment upon. His financial situation was very likely desperate. According to the FBI's retired chief investigator, Ralph Himmelsbach, extortionists and other criminals who steal large amounts of money nearly always do so because they need it urgently, otherwise, the crime is not worth the considerable risk. Alternatively, Cooper may have been a thrill seeker who made the jump just to prove it could be done. Agents theorized that Cooper took his alias from a popular Belgian comics series of the 1970s featuring the fictional hero Dan Cooper, a Royal Canadian Air Force test pilot who took part in numerous heroic adventures, including parachuting. One cover from the series, reproduced on the FBI website, depicts test pilot Cooper skydiving in full paratrooper regalia. Because the Dan Cooper comics were never translated into English, nor imported to the US, they speculated that he had encountered them during a tour of duty in Europe. The Cooper research team suggested the alternative possibility that Cooper was Canadian, and found the comics in Canada, where they were also sold. They noted his specific demand for negotiable American currency, a phrase seldom if ever used by American citizens, since witnesses stated that Cooper had no distinguishable accent, Canada would be his most likely country of origin if he were not a US citizen. Evidence suggested that Cooper was knowledgeable about flying technique, aircraft, and the terrain. He demanded 4 parachutes to force the assumption that he might compel one or more hostages to jump with him, thus ensuring he would not be deliberately supplied with sabotaged equipment. He chose a 727-100 aircraft because it was ideal for a bailout escape, owing not only to its aft airstair but also to the high, aftward placement of all 3 engines, which allowed a reasonably safe jump despite the proximity of the engine exhaust. It had single-point fueling capability, a then recent innovation that allowed all tanks to be refueled rapidly through a single fuel port. It also had the ability, unusual for a commercial jet airliner, to remain in slow, low-altitude flight without stalling, and Cooper knew how to control its airspeed and altitude without entering the cockpit, where he could have been overpowered by the 3 pilots. In addition, Cooper was familiar with important details, such as the appropriate flap setting of 15 degrees, which was unique to that aircraft, and the typical refueling time. He knew that the aft airstair could be lowered during flight, a fact never disclosed to civilian flight crews, since there was no situation on a passenger flight that would make it necessary, and that its operation, by a single switch in the rear of the cabin, could not be overridden from the cockpit. He also may have known that the Central Intelligence Agency was, at the time, using 727s to drop agents and supplies behind enemy lines during the Vietnam War. According to Kay's research team, Cooper's meticulous planning might also have extended to the timing of his operation, and even his choice of attire. The FBI searched but couldn't find anyone who disappeared that weekend, Kay wrote, suggesting that the perpetrator had returned to his normal occupation. If you were planning on going back to work on Monday, then you would need as much time as possible to get out of the woods, find transportation and get home. The very best time for this is in front of a 4-day weekend, which is the timing Dan Cooper chose for his crime. Furthermore, if he was planning ahead, he knew he had to hitchhike out of the woods, and it is much easier to get picked up in a suit and tie than in old blue jeans. The author of Analysis of World War II Aircrew Bailouts concluded that the probability of Cooper's survival may have been higher than suggested by popular opinion. Cooper, he claimed, jumped in conditions that thousands of RAF crewmen survived during World War II. The FBI was more skeptical, concluding that Cooper lacked crucial skydiving skills and experience. We originally thought Cooper was an experienced jumper, perhaps even a paratrooper, said Special Agent Larry Carr, leader of the investigative team from 2006 until its dissolution in 2016. We concluded after a few years this was simply not true. No experienced parachutist would have jumped in the pitch-black night, in the rain, with a 172 miles per hour wind in his face wearing loafers and a trench coat. It was simply too risky. He also missed that his reserve parachute was only for training and had been sewn shut, something a skilled skydiver would have checked. He also failed to bring or request a helmet, chose to jump with the older and technically inferior of the 2 primary parachutes supplied to him, and jumped into a probable -9 degrees Celsius wind at 3,000 meters in November over Washington state without proper protection against the extreme wind chill. Assuming that Cooper was not a paratrooper, but was an Air Force veteran, Carr suggested the possibility that he was an aircraft cargo loader. Such an assignment would have given him knowledge and experience in the aviation field, and loaders, because they throw cargo out of flying aircraft, wear emergency parachutes and receive rudimentary jump training. Such training would have given Cooper a working knowledge of parachutes, but not necessarily sufficient knowledge to survive the jump he made. The FBI speculated from the beginning that Cooper did not survive his jump. Diving into the wilderness without a plan, without the right equipment, in such terrible conditions, he probably never even got his chute open, said Carr. Even if he did land safely, agents contended that survival in the mountainous terrain at the onset of winter would have been all but impossible without an accomplice at a predetermined landing point. This would have required a precisely timed jump, necessitating, in turn, cooperation from the flight crew. There is no evidence that Cooper requested or received any such help from the crew, nor that he had any clear idea where he was when he jumped into the stormy, overcast darkness. Suspects. Between 1971 and 2016, the FBI processed over 1,000 serious suspects, including assorted publicity seekers and deathbed confessors. Some notable examples are Kenneth Peter Christiansen. In 2003, a Minnesota resident named Lyle Christiansen watched a television documentary about the Cooper hijacking and became convinced that his late brother Kenneth was Cooper. Christiansen enlisted in the Army in 1944 and was trained as a paratrooper. The war had ended by the time he was deployed in 1945, but he made occasional training jumps while stationed in Japan with occupation forces in the late 1940s. After leaving the Army, he joined Northwest Orient in 1954 as a mechanic in the South Pacific, and subsequently became a flight attendant, and then a purser, based in Seattle. Christiansen was 45 years old at the time of the hijacking, but he was shorter, 5 feet 8 in or 173 centimeters, thinner, 150 pounds or 68 kilograms, and lighter complected than eyewitness descriptions of Cooper. Christiansen smoked, as did the hijacker, and displayed a particular fondness for bourbon, the drink Cooper had requested. He was also left-handed. Evidence photos of Cooper's black tie show the tie clip applied from the left side, suggesting a left-handed wearer. Schaffner told a reporter that photos of Christiansen fit her memory of the hijacker's appearance more closely than those of other suspects she had been shown, but could not conclusively identify him. Christiansen reportedly had purchased a house with cash a few months after the hijacking. After Christiansen's death, family members discovered gold coins and a valuable stamp collection, along with over $200,000 in bank accounts. They also found a folder of Northwest Orient news clippings which began about the time he was hired in the 1950s, and stopped just before the date of the hijacking, although the hijacking was by far the most momentous news event in the airline's history. Christiansen continued to work part-time for the airline for many years after 1971, but apparently never clipped another Northwest News story. Research later revealed that Christiansen did not pay cash for the house he bought after the hijacking, but had a mortgage on it, and took 17 years to pay it off. The same search also uncovered evidence that Christiansen had sold off almost 24 acres of land for $17,000 per acre in the mid-1990s, thus accounting for the large sum of money in his account at the time of his death. Despite the publicity generated by Porteous's book and the 2011 television documentary, the FBI is standing by its position that Christiansen cannot be considered a prime suspect. It cites a poor match to eyewitness physical descriptions, a level of skydiving expertise above that predicted by their suspect profile, and an absence of direct incriminating evidence. Bryant Jack Coffield was a con man, ex-convict, and purported government informant who claimed to have been the chauffeur and confidant of Abraham Lincoln's last undisputed descendant, great-grandson Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith. In 1972 he began claiming he was Cooper, and attempted through an intermediary, a former cellmate named James Brown, to sell his story to a Hollywood production company. He said he landed near Mount Hood, about 80 kilometers southeast of Ariel, injuring himself and losing the ransom money in the process. Photos of Coffield bear a resemblance to the composite drawings, although he was in his mid-50s in 1971. He was reportedly in Portland on the day of the hijacking, and sustained leg injuries around that time which were consistent with a skydiving mishap. Coffield's account was reviewed by the FBI, which concluded that it differed in several details from information that had not been made public, and was therefore a fabrication. Brown, undeterred, continued peddling the story long after Coffield died in 1975. Multiple media venues, including the CBS News program 60 Minutes, considered and rejected it. In a 2008 book about Lincoln's descendants, author Charles Lackman revisited Coffield's tale, although it had been discredited 36 years before. L.D. Cooper, a leather worker and Korean War veteran, was proposed as a suspect in July 2011 by his niece, Marla Cooper. As an 8-year-old, she recalled Cooper and another uncle planning something very mischievous, involving the use of expensive walkie-talkies, at her grandmother's house in Sisters, Oregon, 240 kilometers southeast of Portland. The next day Flight 305 was hijacked, and though the uncles ostensibly were turkey hunting, L.D. Cooper came home wearing a bloody shirt, the result, he said, of an auto accident. Later, she said, her parents came to believe that L.D. Cooper was the hijacker. She also recalled that her uncle, who died in 1999, was obsessed with the Canadian comic book hero Dan Cooper, although he was not a skydiver or paratrooper. Barbara Dayton, a recreational pilot and University of Washington librarian who was born Robert Dayton, served in the U.S. Merchant Marine and then the Army during World War II. After discharge, Dayton worked with explosives in the construction field and aspired to a professional airline career, but could not obtain a commercial pilot's license. Dayton claimed to have staged the Cooper hijacking, dressed as a man, to get back at the airline field and the FAA, whose insurmountable rules and conditions had prevented her from becoming an airline pilot. Dayton said that the ransom money was hidden in a cistern near Woodburn, a suburban area south of Portland, but eventually recanted the entire story, ostensibly after learning that hijacking charges could still be brought. The FBI has never commented publicly on Dayton, who died in 2002. William Pratt Gossett was a Marine Corps, Army, and Army Air Forces veteran who saw action in Korea and Vietnam. His military experience included advanced jump training and wilderness survival. After retiring from military service in 1973, he worked as an ROTC instructor, taught military law at Weber State University in Ogden, Utah, and hosted a radio talk show in Salt Lake City that featured discussions about the paranormal. He died in 2003. Gossett was widely known to be obsessed with the Cooper hijacking. He amassed a voluminous collection of Cooper-related news articles, and told one of his wives that he knew enough about the case to write the epitaph for D.B. Cooper. Late in his life he reportedly told 3 of his sons, a retired Utah judge, and a friend in the Salt Lake City Public Defender's Office, that he had committed the hijacking. Photos of Gossett taken circa 1971 bear a close resemblance to the most widely circulated Cooper composite drawing. According to Galen Cook, a lawyer who has collected information related to Gossett for years, Gossett once showed his sons a key to a Vancouver, British Columbia, safe deposit box which, he claimed, contained the long-missing ransom money. Gossett's eldest son, Greg, said that his father, a compulsive gambler who was always strapped for cash, showed him wads of cash just before Christmas 1971, weeks after the Cooper hijacking. He speculated that Gossett gambled the money away in Las Vegas. In 1988, Gossett changed his name to Wolfgang and became a Roman Catholic priest, which Cook and others interpreted as an effort to disguise his identity. Other circumstantial evidence includes testimony that Cook claims to have obtained from William Mitchell, a passenger on the hijacked aircraft, regarding a mysterious physical detail, which he will not divulge, common to the hijacker and Gossett. Cook also claims to have found possible links to Gossett in each of 4 letters, signed by D.B. Cooper and mailed to 3 newspapers within days after the hijacking, although there is no evidence that the actual hijacker created or mailed any of the letters. The FBI has no direct evidence implicating Gossett, and cannot even reliably place him in the Pacific Northwest at the time of the hijacking. There is not one link to the D.B. Cooper case, said Special Agent Carr, other than the statements Gossett made to someone. Robert Richard Lepsey was a 33-year-old grocery store manager and married father of 4 from Grayling, Michigan, who disappeared in October 1969. His vehicle was found 3 days later at a local airport, and a man matching Lepsey's description was reportedly seen boarding a flight to Mexico. Authorities concluded that Lepsy had left voluntarily and closed their investigation. 2 years after the Cooper hijacking, family members noted that Lepsy's physical features resembled those in the Cooper composite drawings, and asserted that Cooper's clothing was described as very similar to Lepsy's grocery store uniform. Lepsy was declared legally dead in 1976. One of Lepsy's daughters submitted a DNA sample to the FBI in 2011, with unknown results. Although Lepsy was proposed as a Cooper suspect in a 2014 book, there is no record of public comment on him from the FBI. John Emil List was an accountant, World War II and Korean War veteran who murdered his wife, 3 teenage children, and 85-year-old mother in Westfield, New Jersey, 15 days before the Cooper hijacking, withdrew $200,000 from his mother's bank account, and disappeared. He came to the attention of the Cooper task force due to the timing of his disappearance, multiple matches to the hijacker's description, and the reasoning that a fugitive accused of mass murder has nothing to lose. After his capture in 1989, List admitted to murdering his family, but denied any involvement in the Cooper hijacking. Although his name continues to appear in Cooper articles and documentaries, no substantial evidence implicates him, and the FBI no longer considers him a suspect. He died in prison in 2008. Theodore Ernest Mayfield was a Special Forces veteran, pilot, competitive skydiver, and skydiving instructor who served time in 1994 for negligent homicide after 2 of his students died when their parachutes failed to open. Later, he was found indirectly responsible for 13 additional skydiving deaths due to faulty equipment and training. His criminal record also included armed robbery and transportation of stolen aircraft. In 2010, he was sentenced to 3 years probation for piloting a plane 26 years after losing his pilot's license and rigging certificates. He was suggested repeatedly as a suspect early in the investigation, according to FBI agent Ralph Himmelsbach, who knew Mayfield from a prior dispute at a local airport. He was ruled out, based partly on the fact that he called Himmelsbach less than 2 hours after Flight 305 landed in Reno to volunteer advice on standard skydiving practices and possible landing zones. Richard McCoy Jr. was an Army veteran who served 2 tours of duty in Vietnam, first as a demolition expert, and later, with the Green Berets as a helicopter pilot. After his military service he became a warrant officer in the Utah National Guard and an avid recreational skydiver, with aspirations, he said, of becoming a Utah State Trooper. April 7, 1972, McCoy staged the best-known of the so-called copycat hijackings. He boarded United Airlines Flight 855 in Denver, Colorado, and brandishing what later proved to be a paperweight resembling a hand grenade and an unloaded handgun, he demanded 4 parachutes and $500,000. After delivery of the money and parachutes at San Francisco International Airport, McCoy ordered the aircraft back into the sky and bailed out over Provo, Utah, leaving behind his handwritten hijacking instructions and his fingerprints on a magazine he had been reading. He was arrested on April 9 with the ransom cash in his possession, and after trial and conviction, received a 45-year sentence. 2 years later he escaped from Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary with several accomplices by crashing a garbage truck through the main gate. Tracked down 3 months later in Virginia Beach, McCoy was killed in a shootout with FBI agents. 1991 book, D.B. Cooper, The Real McCoy. Parole officer Bernie Rhodes and former FBI agent Russell Kalami asserted that they had identified McCoy as Cooper. They cited obvious similarities in the 2 hijackings, claims by McCoy's family that the tie and mother-of-pearl tie clip left on the plane belonged to McCoy, and McCoy's own refusal to admit or deny that he was Cooper. A proponent of their claim was the FBI agent who killed McCoy. "When I shot Richard McCoy," he said, "I shot D.B. Cooper at the same time." Although there is no reasonable doubt that McCoy committed the Denver hijacking, the FBI does not consider him a suspect in the Cooper case because of mismatches in age and description. A level of skydiving skill well above that thought to be possessed by the hijacker, and credible evidence that McCoy was in Las Vegas on the day of the Portland hijacking, and at home in Utah the day after, having Thanksgiving dinner with his family. Sheridan Peterson served in the U.S. Marine Corps during World War II and was later employed as a technical editor at Boeing, based in Seattle. Investigators took an interest in Peterson as a suspect soon after the skyjacking because of his experience as a smoke jumper and love of taking physical risks, as well as his similar appearance and age, 44, to the Cooper description. Peterson often teased the media about whether he was really D.B. Cooper. Entrepreneur Eric Ulis, who spent years investigating the crime, said he was 98% convinced that Peterson was Cooper. But when pressed by FBI agents, Peterson insisted he was in Nepal at the time of the skyjacking. He died in 2021. Robert Wesley Rackstraw was a retired pilot and ex-convict who served on an Army helicopter crew and other units during the Vietnam War. He came to the attention of the Cooper Task Force in February 1978, after he was arrested in Iran and deported to the U.S. to face explosives possession and check-kiting charges. Several months later, while released on bail, Rackstraw attempted to fake his own death by radioing a false mayday call and telling controllers that he was bailing out of a rented plane over Monterey Bay. Police later arrested him in Fullerton on an additional charge of forging federal pilot certificates. The plane he claimed to have ditched was found, repainted, in a nearby hangar. Cooper investigators noted his physical resemblance to Cooper composite sketches, although he was only 28 in 1971, military parachute training, and criminal record, but eliminated him as a suspect in 1979 after no direct evidence of his involvement could be found. In 2016, Rackstraw re-emerged as a suspect in a history program and a book. On September 8, 2016, Thomas J. Colbert, the author of the book, and attorney Mark Zide filed a lawsuit to compel the FBI to release its Cooper case file under the Freedom of Information Act. The suit alleges that the FBI suspended active investigation of the Cooper case in order to undermine the theory that Rackstraw is D.B. Cooper so as to prevent embarrassment for the Bureau's failure to develop evidence sufficient to prosecute him for the crime. One of the Flight 305 flight attendants reportedly did not find any similarities between photos of Rackstraw from the 1970s and her recollection of Cooper's appearance. Rackstraw's attorney called the renewed allegations the stupidest thing I've ever heard, and Rackstraw himself told People.com. It's a lot of bullshit, and they know it is. The FBI declined further comment. Rackstraw stated in a 2017 phone interview that he lost his job over the 2016 investigations. I told everybody I was the hijacker, Rackstraw told Colbert, before explaining the admission was a stunt. He died in 2019. Walter R. Reckey was a Michigan native, military veteran, and original member of the Michigan parachute team. He was proposed as a suspect by his friend Carl Laureen at a press conference on May 17, 2018. In 2008, Reckey told Laureen via a recorded phone call that he was the hijacker. Reckey gave Laureen permission in a notarized letter to share his story after his death. He also allowed Laureen to tape their phone conversations about the crime over a 6-week period in late 2008. In over 3 hours of recordings, Reckey shared details about the hijacking before they were publicly known. He also confessed to his niece, Lisa's story. From Reckey's description of the terrain on his way to the drop zone, Laureen concluded that he landed near Cle Elum, Washington. After Reckey described an encounter with a dump truck driver at a roadside cafe after he landed, Laureen located Jeff Osiadax, who was driving his dump truck near Cle Elum the night of November 24, 1971, and met a stranger at the Teenaway Junction Cafe just outside of town. The man asked Osiadax to give his friend directions to the cafe over the phone, and he complied. Reckey reportedly confirmed that Osiadax was the man at the cafe, after seeing a photo Laureen sent him. According to Laureen, Joe Koenig, a forensic investigator, found no evidence of tampering or manipulation, and no discrepancies from available FBI records that eliminated Rickey as a suspect. Koenig later published a book on Cooper, titled Getting the Truth, IMDb Cooper. In November 2018, The Oregonian published an article proposing William J. Smith, of Bloomfield, New Jersey, as a suspect. The article was based on research conducted by an Army data analyst, who sent his findings to the FBI in mid-2018. Smith, a New Jersey native, was a World War II veteran. After high school, he enlisted in the Navy and volunteered for combat aircrew training. After his discharge, he worked for the Lehigh Valley Railroad and was affected by the Penn Central Transportation Company bankruptcy in 1970, the largest bankruptcy in U.S. history at that time. The article proposed that the loss of his pension created a grudge against the corporate establishment and transportation field. It also created a sudden need for money. He was 43 at the time of the hijacking. In Smith's high school yearbook, a list of alumni killed in World War II lists an Ira Daniel Cooper, possibly the source for the hijacker's pseudonym. The analyst claimed that Smith's naval aviation experience would have given him knowledge of planes and parachutes, and his railroad experience would have helped him find railroad tracks and hop on a train to escape the area after landing. According to the analyst, aluminium spiral chips found on the clip-on tie could have come from a locomotive maintenance facility. Smith's information about the Seattle area may have come from his close friend Dan Clare, who was stationed at Fort Lewis during World War II. The analyst noted that the man who claimed to be Cooper in Max Gunther's 1985 book identified himself as Dan LeClaire. Smith and Clare worked together for Conrail in Newark, New Jersey, at the Oak Island Yard. Smith retired from that facility as a yardmaster. The article noted that a picture of Smith on the Lehigh Valley Railroad website showed a remarkable resemblance to Cooper FBI sketches. The FBI responded to media requests with its usual boilerplate statement that commenting about specific tips would be inappropriate. Dwayne L. Weber was a World War II Army veteran who served time in at least 6 prisons from 1945 to 1968 for burglary and forgery. He was proposed as a suspect by his widow, based primarily on a deathbed confession. 3 days before he died in 1995, Weber told his wife Jo, "I am Dan Cooper." The name meant nothing to her, she said, but months later, a friend told her of its significance in the hijacking. She went to her local library to research D.B. Cooper, found Max Gunther's book, and discovered notations in the margins in her husband's handwriting. Jo then recalled, in retrospect, that Weber once had a nightmare during which he talked in his sleep about jumping from a plane, leaving his fingerprints on the aft stairs. He also reportedly told her that an old knee injury had been incurred by jumping out of a plane. Like the hijacker, Weber drank bourbon and chain-smoked. Other circumstantial evidence included a 1979 trip to Seattle and the Columbia River, during which Weber took a walk alone along the river bank in the Tina Bar area. 4 months later, Brian Ingram made his ransom cash discovery in the same area. The FBI eliminated Weber as an active suspect in July 1998 when his fingerprints did not match any of those processed in the hijacked plane, and no other direct evidence could be found to implicate him. Later, his DNA also failed to match the samples recovered from Cooper's tie, though the Bureau has since conceded that they cannot be certain that the organic material on the tie came from Cooper. The case remains unsolved. Thank you all so much for listening. I really hope that you enjoyed today's strange tale. If you did, please smash that gorgeous like button, and subscribe so that you will be notified to future shows. Also, if you could write a 5-star review, that would really help us get the word out, so other people can enjoy the podcast as well. You can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube at Strange Tales Pod. Or you can message me at strangetalespod@gmail.com, with feedback or ideas on future shows. If you would like to support the podcast, you can do so through Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Strange Tales Pod, where we have plans from as little as $3 a month and you can opt out anytime. Any help is much appreciated. This is me, your host Winston R. Douglas, signing out for now. Thanks again, hope to see you again soon.